African countries today that still practice growing enough food to keep themselves healthy, like in present-day Nanyuki, Kenya. There's quite a few regions. Then there's this book that I got some months back by James Sussman. That it's a book called Work. I forget. I think it's like the Paleolithic times that have robots or something like that. I forget the name of it, but it's called Work. If you want to look for it, it's called James Sussman's book called Work. And he studied. I think he's an anthropologist, and he studied the African tribes in Africa, and how they. I forget the name of the tribe. The Johansi, but I think they have a click to they have like this click to their language. It's a strange language. But basically what Sussman is saying is something I was saying way back in my earlier videos, that, it's like anti-capitalism. And so the book is basically like, hey, we're working most of our lives and we're pushing ourselves to work so much, where back in the day, hunters and gatherers did not work so much. They spent a couple hours hunting for food in the morning, and the rest of the day they smoked pot and had sex. Leisure time. And if I'm not mistaken, in that particular area that he was from, some British came. I don't remember exactly who came. And then they bought a bunch of land in that area, and then they had forced a lot of the people to work there for small amounts of money or something like that. I don't remember exactly, so don't quote me. But I'll be doing a video on that eventually, specifically. But some of the tribes that still live in Africa today, they know of certain plants where they could dig up and then they could get water from them, and they know how to hunt and live off the land. And even parts of the desert that seem like almost impossible to live at, they live there to this day. But there's a lot more parts of Africa, I guess, like city type places, where there's a lot more poorer people that rely on the system and the government and the society to help them out. And that's the difference between somebody that lives off the land, because you could always rely on the land, and if it goes to a drought or something, you could go to some other part. But I guess people in the city, they're kind of stuck there. But I digress. So scientists have found that life expectancy in the Congo was about 30 years of age during the 17th and 18th centuries. And the same was true for people in parts of Europe and in Americas as well. And Africa was doing all right for itself, just as every other continent was doing at that time. But you got to remember the 17th and 18th centuries, what was going on then. Muslims were conquering most of the northern parts of Africa, and there was a lot of slave trade going on then, when the Muslims were coming in, and then the Byzantines before them. And so there was a lot of that going on. So there's a lot of human merchandise and other types of merchandise too, to trade for humans and horses and whatever else in Africa. But life expectancy wasn't very high. I mean, to some people, yes, but a lot of people no. As we talked about in some of my Christopher Columbus videos, a lot of people were dying pretty early. And people died really early because of droughts. Sometimes it was hard to find food at certain times when there was like a drought and there's like 1,000 people there, and then it's like, what do we do now? We're going to move all 1,000 people? So people in the North America, South America, Africa, Europe, they all had pretty much the same thing going on about the same time as far as life expectancy goes. Some scientists had said, allegedly. But as far as politics in Africa, politically in Africa, they had like social classes and a strata in a lot of areas, especially Muslim areas, just as European and Beringian nations did as well. If you heard in the other videos, I talked about the Aztecs. They had the caziques and their kings in the top of the temples. Then you got your kings in Europe, and then you got your sultans in Muslim territories. But most African nations lived in societies where decision-making was done by a small number of elite people at the time. In 30% of Africa, large empires dominated the politics. In the year 1600, there were 200 independent states along the coast by the slave trade, and decisions on war and trade were made by the political elite of the particular polities. And African states had poor people and rich people. They had the ability through intellect or hard work to eventually move up the ladder of the economic strata. And Olaudah Equiano, I have a book. Well, I'll do a book review on him. I bought that book so long ago, man. Olaudah Equiano, which was an eventually freed slave in America, mentioned in his book that some of the elite had scar markings on them in Africa to signify their importance. I think, man, I haven't read that book in like 7 or 8 years. Olaudah Equiano, he was brought to America and he was a slave. And then he was freed. And I think he traveled to Europe and he wrote a book. And I think he got somebody took him as a slave again. They're like, you're not free and you're my slave now. And he's like, what the hell, man? But anyways, yeah, so he wrote a book about Africa when he was in Africa. And he talked about some of the norms back in Africa where he was stolen by bandits. But there weren't big economic gaps between the rich and poor in Africa. But there was a definite class of have and have-nots. Africans didn't own land. They owned slaves as their wealth. A lot of the places. Now, Senegambia was one of the first African territories to participate in the slave trade during the late 15th century. It was mostly the Jolof Kingdom in the Senegal Basin, while the Mali dominated the remote regions. East Africa didn't have a lot to do with the Atlantic besides a little bit of trade. And the Europeans didn't yet settle in Africa in the early years of trading. It was safer for the Europeans to trade with the coastal African kingdoms than it was for the Europeans to go inland. Now you have to remember at this time, a lot of Islam had made their way going east or westbound to the coast, all the way to Morocco. And they had a lot of these African states either convert to Islam either by fear or conquest. But Islam was becoming such a big superpower at the time that they were becoming very rich and very economically and militarily strong that a lot of people could possibly looked up to and be like, hey, I want to be on their side. So there you go. And so a lot of the trade between the Muslims to build things and the Africans, North Africa, had to do with slavery because slavery was wealth and power as well. Now I have a book by Alan Taylor. I had it some years ago. That's where I got some of these older notes written. The book was called American Colonies. Then there's another book by John K. Thornton called A Cultural History of the Atlantic World that I took a lot of notes from as well. Then, of course, my newest book, The Black Eunuchs of the Ottoman Empire by George June. Networks of Power in the Court of the Sultan. So this whole presentation is going to be a bunch of different notes from all these different guys. So the African slave trade grew to peak around the year 1700 and after to as many as 50,000 people per year until America stopped taking Africans in the 19th century. I think it was Thornton that said it that from the 15th century to the 19th century there must have been near 15 million Africans that were traded to the Europeans. There were approximately 3 Africans to every 1 European that crossed the Atlantic during the first few centuries. And there was a guy named Gonzalo Fernandez Oviedo that when he came to Hispaniola, he called it the New Guinea, Africa, since it was so heavily populated with Africans. Because there wasn't a lot of farmers there. There was a lot of plantations. There was, one guy with a few people in his family would own like 50 slaves or something like that, more or less. So the population was overwhelmingly more African, right? And a lot of these African kingdoms really wanted us in Africa. They wanted to trade slaves with the Europeans for guns and other firearms. Others traded for other things like ivory, for example. But the majority of the trade wars was for firearms to be used in the battles. Because remember, a lot of Africans were turning against each other to, steal slaves and stuff like that. And the more slaves you got, the more wealth you got, and the better your country is for war and to build, right? And so that's what was in their mind back then in Africa and other places, everywhere else at the same time as well. But some African states did not believe in firearms, though. The Lunda Empire invaded Angola and brought back a big amount of slaves to be sold, but they did not want to trade for firearms because they thought of guns as weak. They called guns a coward's weapon. That's the Lunda Empire. They're like, hey man, you're just gonna shoot him? Forget it. Use your fist. You're shooting because you're weak. Too bad they can't convince people in Chicago about that. I met a older black guy, about 60, 70 years old, in a lawyer's office about 3 or 4 years ago, and I sat with him for quite a while, and I had a conversation with him, and he was telling me, because we're both from Chicago, he was telling me, like, back in the day, in early days of Chicago, a lot of people were fighting after school. Like, lots of people were using bats, and they were using their fists and stuff like that, but nobody had guns. But they were fist fighting, like, every day, he said. He said it was pretty wild back then. But nowadays, that doesn't really happen in Chicago. There's more guns and knives and people dying than getting beat up. So he says. But why couldn't they be influenced by the Lunda Empire from Africa back in the day? But I digress. Back in Africa, not all the coastal areas participated in the slave trade. They participated in trading with Europeans with other commodities. Like Liberia to the Ivory Coast never traded more than just a small number of slaves. And countries like Benin only traded for part of the 16th century, then only traded in commodities as in pepper and ivory. And Benin started selling slaves again in the 18th century, but stopped again towards the middle of the century, and continued selling pepper and ivory and other commodities. A Jesuit priest named Alonso de Sandoval made a survey among the newly arriving slaves in present-day Colombia. He mapped out where the slaves had come from in Africa and some of their stories. And so Sandoval believed that most of his informants were enslaved by war. And then some were stolen by bandits and pirates. Like I mentioned earlier, Olaudah Equiano was stolen by bandits. And some of the Africans were put up for slave trade because they were being punished for crimes. But there was another guy, a Moravian missionary named Christian George Andreas Oldendorp, who was another one of the first people to write on the conditions and biographies of the African slaves that came to America. And among Oldendorp's informants, they had some of the same background as the Africans of Sandoval's informants. 3/4 of them were taken violently, either by war or bandits and pirates. And about 1/4 of them were taken by kidnapping on the other side of the road or river. And Olaudah Equiano was one of the Africans that was kidnapped by bandits. And Equiano learned how to read and write, and he later wrote a book about his life and how he was captured. This book's easy to get if you'd like to look it up. Olaudah Equiano. So one of the biggest pieces of evidence that of what happened to the African slaves and their biographies comes from the survivors of a Spanish ship named the Amistad that finally ended up in Connecticut in the year 1839. And all the slaves came from the Mande tribe, in which is in modern-day Sierra Leone. And most of the African informants gave detailed biographies of themselves to a Yale University professor. And again, 2/3 of the men were enslaved by war, bandits and pirates, while others were sent as slaves because of judicial reasons, in which they may have been either for adultery or debt or something like that. Now, to ask yourself the question of why the Africans would sell other Africans to Europeans is to understand the economy and the politics of Africa. And most of the slaves that were involved in the transatlantic slave trade were not slaves of the region from which they were originally from. African leaders wouldn't want to lose their own countrymen, which and therefore would hurt their country, their military, and their economy, as I had mentioned already. So most of the slaves were from neighboring countries that were either captured by war or by bandits. And if an African leader captured a large amount of these humans from a neighboring tribe, he would hurt that neighboring country's military and economy. And they would keep some of their own slaves in trade and amount with the Europeans. So they were strengthening their own country while hurting their neighbors. And a guy named Philip Curtin said that the African warfare was driven by either two different things. Either it was a fiscal, in which a certain amount of slaves would represent wealth, or it was for political aims, with the capturing of slaves was secondary to that. Now, I see a lot of YouTube channels about black people talking about how back in the day, black people had really high ranks in office, and they were really respected individuals back then. Back in the day, before America, or before now. Before now, anywhere, right? But of course, it all has a history and it all has a reason. It's not just America, it's not just Europe. It's not just Islam. I mean, it has everything to do with everything, because Africans helped out the Byzantine. They helped out the Muslims. I mean, you could call them Uncle Toms if you like, or however you want to call them, because I don't know if you could call them an Uncle Tom in Islam, but kind of the same, degree, right? Now, slavery has been going around for thousands of years. And into the Byzantine time, even beforehand, but during the Byzantine time, they were using eunuchs, black eunuch and white eunuch, right? And Asiatic. And that went to Rome and to the Byzantine through Constantinople. And then Constantinople eventually turned into, it was conquered by the Muslims, the Ottomans, and was renamed Istanbul. And of course, the Muslims had just as many, they weren't original to the eunuch, but they practiced it just as well as anybody else did. And of course, I see a lot of these black videos have pictures of these black eunuchs in Islamic clothing. And you have to give those historical people some kind of some respect, man. They had some really cool positions back then, because a lot of those black eunuchs were in charge of all the women slaves. Now, there's a book by Noel Barber called Lord of the Golden Horn, which is a fantastic book. It goes really deep into detail as far as the this guy named Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. And he has eunuchs, black eunuchs, and he has 300 slave women that he has sex with sometimes, some of them. And a lot of the women are stuck in these rooms, and there's different stratas. The women that have kids with the Sultan, they get their own private room. And then the ones in the bottom of the strata, there's sometimes like 10 women to a room, because he doesn't really care about them until they might catch his eye one day, and he'd be like, okay, you come back out. But the black eunuchs had to take care of these girls, and they were the black eunuchs were like their only connection to the outside world. Now, these eunuchs were usually castrated. They were all castrated. Black eunuchs, and every eunuch, every race of eunuch was castrated. But the Muslims had something against castration in their religion, so they usually had non-Muslim people castrate the eunuchs for them. And sometimes people would castrate eunuchs in Africa before they would sell the eunuchs. And I get a whole thing about it. I get so much detail from the I got a book that goes really into detail about this stuff. Not so much the Lord and the Golden Horn, the other book. But a few hundred women are sitting in this room and they can't go outside. And nobody could come in because those rooms are off limit. And if I'm not mistaken, in the Islamic territories, if you cross the wrong line, you're going to be killed. So the only people that are allowed in the harem is the sultan and the eunuchs. And the children, until the children get to be about a certain age. So there's these lonely women sitting in these big rooms. And Suleiman the Magnificent had 300 of them, according to Noel Barber. And these people lived in Istanbul, conquered Constantinople. So when these women were laying there, horny, not seeing a sultan for a long time because he's off at war or he's with one of his wives, these women are like, well, who are we going to have sex with? So a lot of them, there's talk about some of them getting cucumbers snuck into the harem. And then there's a lot of lesbianism, because what else are they going to do? And then there's these eunuch guys, and they're like, well, since you're here, there's probably a lot of sex with the eunuchs, one way or the other. So they had pretty high positions coming from Africa. And that's what a lot of these African guys are talking about. And the George June, that wrote the Black Eunuchs of the Ottoman Empire book, mentioned how the eunuchs that were castrated compared to the not castrated slaves. The ones that were castrated were smarter because they didn't have sexual desire, I guess, and so they kept a lot of their energy in their minds, and so that's how a lot of these eunuchs got really high positions, whether they were in Africa, the Middle East, or Europe or Asia, because everybody wanted their hands on these eunuchs, all the way, to Asia, to the west coast of Africa, to Spain, also. But I digress. Africa was robbed of its people and human resource. And the transatlantic slave trade took 12 million people, but the Ottoman Empire took 14 million people. And Africans were stolen from their families and their towns and brought to a foreign place, to a foreign owner that owned them. And like I said, a lot of times their balls were cut off. How good does that sound? But like I said, a lot of these black eunuchs were in charge of women. So the seraglio is a place where the harems would be, and all these women would be, and people would be having a lot of sex with these sex slave women of the Ottoman Empire. And June makes a comparison to the 18th century slave owner from Jamaica named Thomas Thistlewood. And Thistlewood himself, in Jamaica, had recorded in his journals thousands of sexual encounters with over 100 different slave women on his plantation. And if I'm not mistaken, he I think he married one or called one of them his wife. And he would give, some girls like gifts and stuff like that. And so there's a lot of jealousy and girls that were trying to have sex with this guy so they could move up the strata. And the same thing was going on inside of the Ottoman Empire. But we'll talk about that in another episode. Right now we're talking about Africa. And for some odd reason, there's a lot of research and there's a lot of documentation on American slavery from slaves themselves or other people that wrote about it, but there's like tons of literature on American slavery. And as far as slavery goes, from people being captured in Africa to the Muslims, there's like no damn writings about it at all. I've been everywhere talking to everybody. So far, I haven't found any. Very little. I mean, these people came into other people's towns or villages and stole their daughters or kids or wives or whatever and took them away, and they stole them from their family and village. And it's just like, and everybody just like, okay, whatever, let's just go back to what we were doing. That was a pretty crazy thing. You would think somebody would write about it. Well, there was a guy named Hudud al-Alam that said that in 982, or the year 982 to 983, that most of the eunuchs were stolen from Sudan. And he said that a lot of the merchants from Egypt would steal children and then castrate them and then sell them to Europe. He also said that some of the Sudanese would steal other people's children and then sell them to the market. Now this is back in the 900s. That's like 1100 years, almost 1100 years ago. Now there was a queen in Africa named Hausa, Queen Amina, who received 40 eunuchs and 10,000 kola nuts in tribute from the Sudanese. Then there was the king of the Kano kingdom, Abdullah Burha, in the year 1430, that received 1,000 slaves a month. And he went to the most southern part of his land, to his empire, and with all these slaves, and on his way back, he would drop off 500 women and 500 men and say, have sex, populate yourself, so I could use more of you and build my kingdom. I mean, at what point of time or in life can it be okay to steal somebody, steal people for any reason? They must have been busy to get 1,000 slaves a month. That must have been a lot of wars and fighting. And now there was the Yakuba in the 1450s that traded horses for eunuchs. They got 12 eunuchs for 10 horses back in those days. What a deal. And these Kano rulers were using slaves and eunuchs way before the Ottoman Empire started. Well, Islam started in the year 610. So Islam was getting their way around North Africa a lot at that time and spreading way past the death of Muhammad. But like I said, they were the Africans were trading slaves with the Byzantine Empire and the Muslim powers at the time. Because in the year 711, when Islam had invaded and conquered Spain, a lot of the soldiers were black slaves from Muslim armies, right? So there's some evidence right there in the 8th century that there was already Islamified black Muslims fighting under the Islamic name. Which, when they got to Spain, they turned a lot of the churches into mosque, and a lot of the territories into Muslim areas, and they put a jizya on anybody that wasn't converted to Islam at the time. So yeah, they had a lot of these African slaves and black eunuchs at the time. Castrated, a lot of them were castrated, not a lot of them not. There was a Mosey people that punished criminals by castration. But a lot of these guys were taken care of, these eunuchs and black slaves. A lot of them rose the power. There was Katumbi in the year 622, and he was a warrior ruler. And when he went to war, he had 100 horses and musicians following him, and 100 eunuchs who were dressed really nice and had gold hanging from them and stuff like that. See, the more conquest and slaves, the more power you get, right? The more power you get to dress up everybody in gold. So there's that Volta River basin called the Mosey, where there's a large Sunni Muslim people there in Burkina Faso region, in the current Nigeria area. And that area was very famous for the eunuch trade, chiefly selling them in Egypt and in Turkey. Now there was the Bornu tribe, which was, or the Bornu, which was one of West Africa's oldest empires, stretching east and west of Lake Chad. And they were selling a lot of these eunuchs and slaves. Well, the Turkish merchants at the time might have paid $250 to $300 for a eunuch. And the Sultan of Bornu had 200 of his own eunuchs in the harem, protecting his sex slave women. He's like, hey man, I'm going to go out for a war for a couple months or some weeks or whatever it is. You take care of my women. Just make sure they don't leave. And the guy's like, hey man, I'll protect them at the door. I'll stand at the door, get them whatever they need. Can you imagine that? Hundreds of women. Insane. But that didn't only happen in Africa. It was in the Middle East too, and in Europe. But I mean, it was way before the transatlantic slave trade that when Islam started making its way around North Africa, slavery became real popular around the year 900 in the Common Era. And people as far as West Africa were enslaved and transported to Europe and Asia, including Muslim lands. What was happening the whole time? Even Muhammad, when he was living in Mecca, he was he was in that last war that he was in. He took some slaves. I think I mentioned in that video that I have, the Islamic video. A lot of these guys would conquer lands, and then they would tell their soldiers, like, hey guys, after we kick all their guys' asses, you could take all the women and children you like. Because there was no age limit back in those days. Like I said before, through the eyes of presentism, we're trying to look at, the old times, with modern day eyes, and it's just like almost impossible. But yeah, the Arab armies, they went across the Middle East and Africa and Europe, and a lot of the soldiers were rewarded with children and women and wives of people they conquered. But the slave trade was of all races at the time. But of course it was hard for those people. I mean, they were stolen from their place and then having to live under a rule of somebody else. They didn't have completely free life. But there was some manumission as well, formal manumission. Some of the soldiers of the north of the Sahara were, after they completed their training, were sometimes freed. Although south of the Sahara, they didn't practice manumission to the degree that the north did. Although the guys in the south could raise in rank through war and eventually own their own slaves, and so on and so forth. But of course, by the 17th century, the slave trade was really huge in Western Africa. And the Arab world kept the slaves coming back and forth, through their down their roads. And then when the slaves started coming to the Americas, it was even busier times for stealing people and selling them from the African coast. But I'm not sure about America so much as the trans-Saharan slave trade, where the trans-Saharan slave trade favored young women in a ratio 2-to-1 over males. Where America, I think they liked guys more. From movies and pictures, what I see, there's a lot of men slaves more than women. But in the this trans-Saharan slave trade, it was the opposite. And according to a historian named Hugh Thomas, he talked about how the Muslims in Spain, they bought a lot of slaves from, mostly from a territory of the Slavs. And that name, the name from the Slavs from the area became a synonym for the Arabic word eunuch. So maybe they were originally called eunuchs and then they were called slaves afterwards. I don't know. But the slave markets in North Africa in the Middle Ages held Christians captive from Spanish and Italian ports and villages. Yeah, these Arabs were trading a lot of slaves back then, and they were trading a lot of African young boys and girls as slaves to have them sent to Cordoba and Baghdad. They were using these young girls as concubines, and they're using the young men to grow up to be good warriors, and some of them servants. Now, Egypt in the 10th century had a really high demand for these eunuchs, and so did Baghdad, which bragged about having about 7,000 eunuchs at the time. And, these eunuchs and these African slaves were brought all the way to China, to East Africa, West Africa, Europe. You got to remember that the Muslims took over a lot of the trade routes in Europe to Asia. So they were selling a lot of these eunuchs to Asian areas. They conquered... The Muslims conquered lots of parts of India, and of course they brought their black eunuchs and black slaves with, and the young black women concubines, and European ones too, right? And Asiatic. So when a lot of these guys, you say like, hey, look, we had black people in Africa back in, this year. It's like, well, yeah, a lot of them were brought there as slaves or eunuchs, right? And if you see they got turbans on their head, it makes a lot more sense now, doesn't it? He doesn't have that towel on his head just because he just got out of the shower. But Ethiopia was another great source for a resource as far as slavery goes. Now, there was a real famous black eunuch that ruled from the 10th century in Egypt. His name was Nubian Abu al-Misk Kafir. And he became the regent from the year 965 to 968 Common Era. And he was a very competent ruler in the position. And not a lot of Africans made it to that height of power. But he did. But he was originally purchased as a slave in the year 923. And he's recorded having a dark complexion. And he was a eunuch. So a lot of these black Africans rose to some really high positions after being caught as slaves. Not every slave had it great, and not every sex slave woman had it great either. But I'll get into that in different videos. But I just wanted to cover what was going on in Africa at the time of in the early days. Anyways, that's it for this video. It's getting way too long. People hate that. So anyways, the conclusion to this video is just basically how Africa just started working together with Asia and Europe, and then later America. So I just want to get a little bit of a beginning of what was going on in Africa before 1492, I guess. That's it. Adios.